The basket hit the water with a sound like breaking bones. 3 wolf pups, 8 days old, eyes milky white with blindness, tumbled into the iron falls, where the river doesn't flow, it devours. The current was so violent it had a voice, a roar that swallowed screams before they could form. Alpha King Leander Tide stood at the cliff's edge, rain hammering his face, and watched them sink. "The law of the torrent is absolute," he said. "Let the river decide." But the loss of Vance, the Omega healer no one noticed, no one valued, didn't wait for the river's verdict. She jumped. Hello friends, welcome back to the channel. If this story moves you, drop a comment below telling me what you would have done in Thalassa's position. And now, let's dive into a world where mercy is rebellion and courage is a death sentence. The rain in the north didn't fall, it attacked. It hammered the earth with a fury that turned soil into rivers and rivers into weapons. At the edge of the Iron Falls, where the water churned white and violent enough to strip flesh from bone, the Frostclaw pack gathered in grim ceremony. This was the early Middle Ages of the Wolf Realms, a time when packs ruled territories with teeth and law. When weakness wasn't pitied, it was exterminated. The strong survived. The weak fed the earth. There was no middle ground, no mercy, no exception. Alpha King Leander Tide stood at the precipice like a monument carved from stone and ice. His fur-lined cloak whipped in the gale, and his eyes, amber, cold, pitiless, surveyed his pack with the detachment of a butcher examining meat. He was not a king who loved his people. He was a king who used them, and they feared him for it. At his feet sat a woven basket, the kind used to carry bread or herbs, but today it carried something far more fragile. Inside, 3 wolf pups huddled together, their small bodies trembling from cold and confusion. They were 8 days old. Their eyes had barely opened, and when they did, the pack had gasped in horror. Milky white, clouded, blind. In Leander's world, a wolf who could not see the enemy was worse than useless. It was a contamination, a flaw in the bloodline that would weaken the pack for generations. The pup's mother had wept, begged, pleaded. Leander had her removed from the ritual. Compassion, he said, was a disease. The pack elders stood in a solemn semicircle, their faces hard as the cliffs beneath their feet. The warriors, drenched and silent, formed the outer ring, and at the very edge, barely visible among the Omegas and servants, stood Thalassa Vance. She was unremarkable in every way the pack valued. No great strength, no dominant bloodline, no mate to elevate her status. She was a healer, a woman who spent her days grinding herbs and stitching wounds, invisible to those who mattered. But for the past 7 days, she had done something foolish, something dangerous. She had tried to save the pups. Every dawn, she'd crept to the nursery and placed warm compresses over their clouded eyes. She'd whispered old prayers her grandmother taught her, prayers to the Moon Mother and the spirits of the forest. She'd tried every remedy in her knowledge, every charm, every desperate hope. And every morning, the milky film remained. Now, standing in the rain with her red hair plastered to her skull and her healer's dress soaked through, Thalassa felt the weight of failure crushing her chest. Leander raised his hand, and the murmuring ceased. His voice, when it came, was a hammer striking iron. "The law of the torrent is absolute," he declared, his words carrying over the thunder and the roar of the falls. "Since the time of the first fathers, we have brought our flawed to this sacred water. If the Great Spirit deems them worthy of life, the current will carry them gently to the shallows, where they may crawl out reborn. If the Spirit finds them wanting, the pack cleanses the pack of weakness." Thalassa's stomach twisted. She'd heard this speech before. It was the same speech given before they drowned the deformed, the sickly, the ones born wrong. The law of the torrent wasn't a test, it was an execution dressed in ritual. "These pups," Leander said, nudging the basket with his boot, "cannot see the world the Moon Mother gave us. They cannot hunt, they cannot guard, they cannot serve the pack. They are a burden we will not carry." The Lossa's hands clenched into fists. Her heart screamed her to speak, but her mind, her rational, survival-oriented mind, begged her to stay silent. Challenging an alpha king in the middle of a sacred ritual was suicide. But then she looked at the basket. She saw one tiny paw slip through the woven reeds, reaching towards the sound of the rain, and something inside her broke.
"Leander, stop!" The words tore from the Lossa's throat before her mind could cage them. The sound cut through the storm like a blade through silk, and the entire pack froze. Elders turned, warriors stiffened, even the rain seemed to pause in shock. No one interrupted the law of the torrent, ever. Leander's head swiveled toward her with the slow, predatory precision of a wolf who just spotted prey. His amber eyes found her in the crowd of Omegas, and Thalassa felt the weight of his gaze like a hand around her throat. But she didn't lower her eyes. She couldn't, not when 3 innocent lives were seconds from death. "Healer," Leander said, his voice deceptively soft, "you forget your place." "They are 8 days old," Thalassa said, stepping forward. Her legs trembled, but she forced them steady. "Even a sighted wolf could not survive this current. You're not testing them, you're murdering them." A collective gasp rippled through the pack. To accuse the Alpha King of murder during a sacred ritual was beyond defiance. It was blasphemy. Thalassa had spent her entire life being small, being quiet, being the woman who bowed her head when warriors passed, who stepped aside when dominance approached, who swallowed her opinions like bitter medicine because speaking meant punishment. She'd watched injustices for years and said nothing. She'd seen the strong devour the weak and told herself it was the way of the world. But this was different. These were babies, helpless, innocent, and she had held them in her arms. She had felt their heartbeats against her palm, had heard their tiny whimpers when they were hungry, had watched them nuzzle blindly toward warmth and comfort. She knew them, and she could not let them die without a fight. "They are flawed," Leander said, each word carved from ice. "And you, Omega, are a fool if you think compassion will change the laws that have kept this pack strong for 1,000 years. Strength without mercy isn't strength. It's just cruelty in a crown." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Leander's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, but something worse. Amusement. He looked at her the way a man looks at an insect before crushing it beneath his boot. "You wish to argue philosophy with me, healer?" Leander said. "Very well, let me educate you." He stepped closer to the basket, his massive frame blocking it from view. In the winters of the Great Famine, our ancestors faced a choice: feed the weak and watch the entire pack starve, or sacrifice the few to save the many. Do you know what they chose? The Lossa's jaw clenched. That was survival. This is survival. Leander's voice cracked like thunder. Every blind wolf we allow to live is one more mouth that cannot feed itself, one more liability in battle, one more weakness our enemies will exploit. I do not make these laws out of cruelty, Omega. I make them out of necessity. "Then you're a coward," the Lhasa whispered. The pack inhaled as one. Leander smiled. It was the smile of a predator who'd just been given permission to kill. "You dare?" "I dare because someone has to." The Lhassa's voice rose, fueled by 7 days of sleepless nights and desperate prayers. "You call this necessity, but I call it fear. You're so terrified of appearing weak that you'd slaughter your own children to prove your strength." Leander's hand moved to the basket. His fingers curled around the woven handle. "These pups will have their trial," Leander said coldly, "and you, healer, will learn the price of defiance." He didn't throw the basket. That would have been too merciful, too quick. Instead, with deliberate theatrical cruelty, Leander placed his boot against the side of the basket and pushed, slowly. The basket tipped, balanced on the edge of the cliff for one agonizing heartbeat, and then tumbled over. The pup's tiny cries were swallowed by the roar of the iron falls. The Lhasa didn't sink. Thinking would have stopped her. Thinking would have reminded her that she couldn't swim well, that the river was legendary for its kills, that no Omega had ever defied an Alpha King and lived. But thinking was a luxury she didn't have. She ran toward the cliff's edge, her healer's dress tangling around her legs, and she jumped.
The air left her lungs the moment she left the ground. For one impossible second, the Lhasa was weightless, suspended between the world of law and the world of consequence. Then gravity remembered her, and she plummeted. The impact was violence made liquid. The iron falls didn't welcome her, it punished her. The water hit like 1,000 fists at once, driving the remaining air from her chest in a soundless scream. Cold so intense it burned, flooded every nerve, turning her blood to ice and her muscles to stone. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The current seized her like a living thing, a massive hand that dragged her down and down into darkness that tasted of stone and death. Her dress became a net, wrapping around her legs, pulling her deeper. Panic clawed at her throat. But somewhere beneath the roar of water and the scream of her own terror, the Lhasa heard it, a tiny, pitiful whimper. The pups. She forced her eyes open. The water was so violent it was more foam than liquid, a churning white chaos that made sight nearly impossible. But there, a flash of gray fur tumbling past a submerged log. The Lhasa kicked against the current, her lungs burning, her vision already spotting with darkness. Her fingers closed around Scruff, and she pulled. The first pup came into her arms, small and limp and terrifyingly still. She tucked him into the crook of her left elbow and searched desperately for the others. The river was dragging her sideways now, toward a sound that made her blood freeze, a grinding, crashing roar that could only mean one thing: the teeth of the North. Every child in the Frostclaw territory knew the legend. The teeth were a series of jagged rocks that jutted from the riverbed like the fangs of some ancient sleeping beast. Anything that hit them was shredded: bones, wood, flesh. The teeth did not discriminate. The Lass's head broke the surface for one precious gasp of air, and she saw them, black stone spears rising from the white foam, 50 yards downstream and closing fast. She had seconds, maybe less. Another flash of gray. The second pup, caught in a whirlpool near the bank. The Lhasa lunged, her free hand grasping blindly. Her fingers found fur, then a leg, too thin, too fragile, and she pulled with strength she didn't know she possessed. The second pup came free with a sound like tearing fabric, and she crushed him against her chest alongside his brother. 2. She had 2, but the basket had held 3. The teeth were 30 yards away, 20. The Lass's body was shutting down, her limbs leaden with cold and exhaustion. Every rational part of her screamed to swim for the bank, to save the 2 she held, to survive. But her hands kept searching. 15 yards from the teeth, her fingers brushed something soft at the very bottom of the river. She dove, her mouth opening in a silent prayer, and her hand closed around the smallest of the 3 pups. He was sinking, his tiny body boneless and unmoving. Dead weight. No, not dead. Not yet. The Lhasa kicked upward with everything she had left. Her vision was tunneling, narrowing to a pinprick of gray light. The surface seemed impossibly far. The teeth loomed like a guillotine, and she was going to hit them. She was going to die with 3 pups in her arms, and Leander would call it justice. But then, above, on the cliffs, Leander's voice cut through the storm like a blade. "Stand down," he roared at the warriors who'd moved instinctively toward the river's edge, preparing to help. She made her choice. If she survives the teeth, she is exiled. If she sinks, she is forgotten. The words hit the Lhasa harder than the water had. Even now, even as she fought for her life and the lives of 3 innocents, Leander would let her die, not out of necessity, out of pride. The warriors froze, the pack watched, and the Lhasa understood with perfect crystalline clarity that she was utterly alone. Her feet found purchase on a submerged boulder. She pushed off with her last shred of strength, angling her body away from the teeth. The current caught her differently this time, spinning her in a wild arc. The rocks passed so close, she felt their spray, heard them grinding against each other like gnashing jaws. And then she was past them. The river opened into a wider channel, the current easing just slightly. The Lass's head broke the surface, and she gasped, her throat raw, her chest heaving. The 3 pups were still in her arms, silent and still. She couldn't tell if they were breathing. She couldn't tell if she was breathing. But they were alive. They had to be alive. Because if they weren't, then she had just thrown away everything, her life, her pack, her future, for nothing. The Lass's arms were beyond pain. They had moved past cramping, past burning, into a numb emptiness that felt like the prelude to death. But still, she held the pups. The river carried her now more than she swam, guiding her toward something she couldn't yet see through the curtain of rain and spray. Above and behind her, Leander's voice echoed one more time across the water, cold and final. "Let it be known," he shouted, his words reaching even the Omegas who cowered at the back of the pack. "The Lhasa Vance has broken the sacred law and defied the Alpha King. She is Omega no longer. She is nothing. No pack, no name, no home. If she crawls from that river, she crawls into exile. If any give her aid, they join her in the darkness." The decree settled over the pack like a burial shroud. The Lhasa heard it even through the roar of water, and something inside her, something that had held on through the cold and the terror and the certainty of death, finally cracked. She had known defying Leander meant punishment, but exile? Exile was a death sentence in the werewolf realms. A wolf without a pack was prey. No protection, no territory, no right to hunt or trade, or even speak to those with pack bonds. She would be a ghost, shunned and starving, until the wilderness or loneliness claimed her. And she had chosen this, for 3 pups who might already be dead. Tears mixed with river water on her face. Her chest heaved with sobs that had no sound, swallowed by exhaustion and the lingering taste of the iron falls. She wanted to scream at the injustice of it. She wanted to rage at Leander, at the pack that stood silent, at the Moon Mother herself for making a world so cruel. But she had no breath for rage. She had nothing left but the fading spark of will that kept her arms locked around the pups. Then, impossibly, she felt it. Warmth. It started as a tiny flutter against her chest, so faint she thought she'd imagined it. But it grew, spreading from the pups outward, a gentle heat that pushed back against the murderous cold of the river. It wasn't the warmth of living animals. That heat was faint and fading. This was something else, something deeper. The pups began to hum. Not a sound she heard with her ears, but something she felt in her bones, a vibration that resonated through her exhausted body, like the plucked string of some cosmic instrument. The hum was old, ancient. It tasted of stone and moonlight, and things that had existed long before the first werewolf drew breath. And the river, the violent, merciless iron falls that had killed hundreds, began to change. The current that had been dragging Thalassa toward the next set of rapids suddenly shifted. It didn't slow, but it curved, bending around her as if she were a stone and it was water seeking the path of least resistance. She felt herself being pulled not downstream, but sideways, toward the cliff face where the waterfall thundered. Thalassa's mind screamed that this was wrong, impossible. Rivers didn't change course for drowning wolves, but her body was too tired to fight, and the warmth from the pups was growing stronger, wrapping around her like a blanket woven from starlight. The pack above couldn't see what was happening. The rain and spray hid her from view, but Thalassa saw. She felt, and in that moment, as the river opened before her like a door, she understood that she hadn't saved the pups. They had saved her. The water pulled her through a gap she hadn't noticed before, a narrow cleft in the cliff face, hidden behind the falls themselves. The roar of water became deafening, then muffled, then eerily silent as she passed through a curtain of white foam and into darkness. The current deposited her gently on a shelf of smooth stone, and then it was gone, flowing away as if it had never touched her at all. Thalassa lay on the cold rock, shaking violently, her arms still locked around the three pups. She waited for the cold to claim her, waited for the darkness to become permanent, but the warmth from the pups continued to grow, spreading through her chest, her limbs, pushing back against the hypothermia that should have killed her minutes ago. And in the darkness of that hidden place, a cavern carved by time and water and forgotten by the pack that claimed to know every inch of their territory, the three blind pups opened their milky eyes. They glowed. Silver light, soft and steady, filled the cavern, and for the first time since she'd leapt from the cliff, Thalassa allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't jumped for nothing. The stone beneath Thalassa was older than memory. She could feel it in the smooth, worn surface, polished by centuries of water that no longer reached this hidden shelf. The cavern stretched beyond the reach of the silver light, its ceiling lost in shadow, its walls covered in something that shimmered faintly. Crystals, perhaps, or mineral deposits that caught and reflected the glow from the pup's eyes. Thalassa's body was shutting down. She knew the signs from years of healing work. Her lips were blue, her fingers white and bloodless, her core temperature dropping into the range where the heart simply stops beating. She should be dead already. The river should have killed her. The cold should have finished what the water started. But the warmth from the pups continued to pulse, gentle but insistent, like a heartbeat that wasn't her own. She tried to sit up and failed. Her muscles wouldn't respond. Exhaustion pressed down on her like a physical weight, and her vision swam with dark spots. The pups stirred in her arms, their small bodies wriggling free of her weakening grip. Thalassa wanted to hold them, to make sure they were truly alive, but her arms had become dead weight. The three pups stood on the stone shelf, their legs trembling but steady. Their milky eyes, those useless, clouded orbs that Leander had deemed unworthy of life, were blazing now with silver light that seemed to come from within. The light didn't flicker like flame. It pulsed, synchronized with Thalassa's slowing heartbeat, as if the pups were somehow connected to her life force. One of the pups, the smallest, the one Thalassa had pulled from the riverbed, stepped closer to her face. His tiny paw pressed against her cheek, and the warmth intensified. "Not yet," a voice whispered. Thalassa's eyes snapped open wider. The voice hadn't come from outside her head. It had bloomed inside her mind, soft and layered, like three voices speaking as one. "You jumped for us," the voice continued, and now Thalassa could see the pups' mouths weren't moving. They stood in perfect stillness, their silver eyes fixed on her, and yet the words filled her consciousness as clearly as if someone had spoken directly into her ear. "Now we anchor you. Fair trade, Thalassa Vales." The warmth became heat, spreading from her chest outward, chasing the cold from her limbs. Her heart, which had been fluttering weakly, steadied. Her lungs, which had been gasping uselessly, drew in a full breath. The hypothermia that should have killed her retreated like a beaten enemy. Thalassa gasped and pushed herself upright, her hands shaking but functional. What are you? The three pups sat in a perfect triangle before her, their glowing eyes never blinking. We are what was, they said in unison. We are what should not have been forgotten. We are the sentinels of the shallows, born when the world remembers that sight is not the same as seeing. Thalassa's healer's mind struggled to make sense of the words. Sentinels of the shallows. The phrase tugged at something deep in her memory, a story her grandmother had told her once, late at night when the winter wind howled and the fire burned low. The sentinels were a myth, a legend about wolves born blind who could see the future. Not the future, the pups corrected gently. The truth. The threads that connect action to consequence, the invisible bonds between souls, the secrets buried beneath crowns and thrones. We do not see what will be, we see what is, stripped of all the lies that sight allows. The smallest pup stepped forward again, his silver eyes reflecting Thalassa's exhausted face. The king who threw us into the river, the pup said, his mental voice deepening, aging impossibly. Do you know why he truly feared us? Thalassa shook her head. Because 300 years ago, when the last sentinels were born, they revealed a corruption so deep it shattered the ruling bloodline. Kings do not forget such things, even when they burn the history books. Leander Tide knows the old stories. He knows what we can see. A chill ran down Thalassa's spine that had nothing to do with the river's cold. What can you see? She asked, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. The three pups' eyes flared brighter, and suddenly the cavern walls came alive. Images flickered across the crystalline surfaces like shadows cast by an invisible fire. Visions that Thalassa understood were not memories, but truths hidden from common sight. She saw a young Leander standing over a fallen wolf, his hands red with blood that steamed in the winter air. She saw betrayal, murder, a crown taken rather than earned. She saw the true Alpha King, Leander's own father, dying not in battle as the pack had been told, but by his son's blade in the dark of night. The throne sits on a foundation of ash, the pups whispered, and we were born to speak it aloud. Thalassa stared at the images flickering across the cavern walls, her mind reeling. Regicide, patricide, the ultimate betrayal, the one crime that broke every law the packs held sacred. If what the pups showed her was true, and the certainty in their unified voice left no room for doubt, then Leander Tide had no right to the throne. He was not a king. He was a murderer wearing a crown. Why? Thalassa breathed. Why show me this? The images faded, and the pup's attention returned to her, their silver eyes patient and ancient despite their tiny bodies. Because you were the only one who jumped, the middle pup said. In a pack of 300, you alone chose compassion over law. That makes you the thread through which truth can return to the world. Thalassa wanted to laugh. It came out as a choked, bitter sound. I'm an exile, an omega with no pack, no power, no voice. Who's going to listen to me? They will listen, the largest pup said, his voice carrying an unsettling certainty, because we will make them see what they have refused to see for 20 winters. The smallest pup tilted his head, his milky eyes somehow conveying warmth despite their otherworldly glow. We are called blind because the world does not understand that there are many ways to see. You look with eyes of flesh and light. We look with eyes of truth and time. Your sight shows you surfaces, fur, skin, the masks people wear. Our sight shows us what lies beneath, intention, history, the weight of choices made in darkness. You see souls, Thalassa said, softly, understanding blooming in her chest. We see the threads that bind souls to their actions, the pup corrected. Every choice leaves a mark, Thalassa. Every betrayal, every act of mercy, every moment of courage or cowardice, these things weave patterns that those with flesh eyes cannot perceive. But we see them. We see everything. The middle pup stepped forward, joining his smaller brother, and their voices merged into something that was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but simply eternal. We walk back into the light, and we make Leander see what he has spent 20 years trying to hide.
3 days later, the Frostclaw pack gathered in the great stone hall for the morning feast. The hall was ancient, its walls carved from the living rock of the mountain, its ceiling supported by pillars that had stood for 1,000 years. Torches burned in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows across the assembled wolves. The feast was not for Thalassa. Exiles were not mourned, they were erased, their names struck from the pack records as if they had never existed. No, this feast was for the 3 purified pups, the ones the law of the torrent had claimed. Leander sat at the head of the long table, his face a mask of solemn authority, playing the role of the grieving but resolute king. The pack ate in subdued silence. Even the warriors, who normally boasted and laughed over their meat, kept their voices low. The Omegas served with downcast eyes. The elders picked at their food, their expressions carefully neutral. No one mentioned Thalassa's name. It was forbidden now. But her absence hung over the gathering like smoke, and more than one wolf found their appetite lacking. Leander raised his cup, preparing to give the traditional blessing for the cleansed, when the heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall creaked open. Every head turned, every conversation died. Thalassa Vance stood in the doorway. She was not the bedraggled, desperate Omega who had leapt from the cliff. Her red hair, instead of hanging limp and soaked, was braided with silver thread that caught the torchlight. She wore a cloak that seemed to shimmer between gray and white, made from fur that no one in the pack recognized. Her eyes, once soft and uncertain, were hard as river stone. But it was not Thalassa who made the pack gasp. It was the 3 pups walking at her feet. They moved with impossible precision, their steps synchronized perfectly despite their milky, sightless eyes. They didn't stumble or hesitate. They walked as if they could see better than any wolf in the hall, their small bodies radiating a presence that made the air feel heavier, charged with something old and powerful. Leander's cup slipped from his fingers. It hit the stone floor and shattered. "You!" he breathed, his voice strangled. Then, louder, commanding, "You were exiled, Thalassa. To return is a death sentence." Thalassa stepped into the hall, and the crowd parted before her without conscious thought. The pups followed, their silver eyes beginning to glow faintly even in the torchlight. "I didn't return for your laws, Leander," Thalassa said, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall with a clarity that made some wolves flinch. "I returned for the truth. You threw these pups into the river because you feared them, not because they were weak, because you knew what they could see." "Silence!" Leander roared, rising from his seat. His body began to ripple, the beginnings of a shift rippling beneath his skin. "Those pups are defects, mistakes of nature. They have no place in—" "Are they?" Thalassa interrupted, and her voice held none of the deference an Omega should show an alpha king. She stepped aside, and the pups moved forward as one. The smallest pup, the one Leander had kicked first, the one he had sent tumbling toward death, stopped at the base of the high table. He lifted his blind, glowing eyes to the king. When he spoke, his voice was not the squeak of a newborn. It was layered, ancient, amplified by a power that made the stone floor vibrate beneath the pack's feet. "I see a cave,
20 winters ago. I see a young Leander Tide standing over his father, the true Alpha King, holding a blade of silver. I see the king's throat cut not by an enemy, but a son too impatient for a crown. The silence that followed was absolute. Not a breath, not a heartbeat. The world itself seemed to stop. Then, chaos. Wolves leapt to their feet. Elders clutched their chests. Warriors reached for weapons that weren't there, their hands moving on instinct toward threats they couldn't identify. The Omegas pressed themselves against the walls, their eyes wide with terror. Lies! Leander lunged across the table, shifting mid-leap into his massive, coal-black wolf form. His claws extended, his fangs bared, aiming directly at the pup's throat. He never reached him. The Lhasa stepped forward, and the air around her seemed to thicken, to solidify. Leander's wolf form slammed into an invisible barrier and rebounded, hitting the stone floor with a sickening crack. He shifted back to human form immediately, his face twisted in rage, and something else, something that looked almost like fear. "You dare use magic against your king?" he spat, blood trickling from his split lip. "I used nothing," the Lhasa said coldly, "but they did, because unlike you, Leander, the Great Spirit actually chose them, and the Spirit does not protect murderers." The middle pup stepped forward now, his silver eyes fixed on the assembled elders. "Ask him," the pup said, his voice resonating with command. "Ask your king where his father's body was found. Ask him why silver shavings were in the wound when the official report said it was an animal attack. Ask him why 3 witnesses to his father's final hours all died within a month of suspicious accidents." One of the elders, a gray-furred female named Morna, who had served under the previous king, stood on trembling legs. "Leander," she said, her voice cracking, "answer them. If these accusations are false, speak and let us defend you." Leander's eyes darted around the hall, seeking allies, finding only doubt. His reign, built on 20 years of fear and carefully maintained lies, was crumbling, and the Lhasa, the Omega he had tried to erase, stood at the center of it all, holding the truth he had tried to drown. Elder Morna's question hung in the air like an executioner's blade. The pack held its collective breath, waiting for Leander to defend himself, to deny the accusations with the righteous fury of the innocent. But the king's face had gone pale beneath his dark beard, and his eyes, those cold amber eyes that had watched 3 pups tumble into the river without flinching, now darted from face to face, seeking escape routes rather than allies. "This is absurd," Leander finally said, but his voice lacked its usual command. "You would believe the words of pups, creatures too young to even open their eyes properly? This is Omega manipulation, a trick of—" "Then you won't mind if we show them," the largest pup interrupted, his voice still carrying that impossible ancient resonance. Before Leander could respond, the 3 pups' eyes blazed silver white, so bright that wolves had to shield their faces. The light didn't just fill the hall, it transformed it. The stone walls began to shimmer, and suddenly they were no longer looking at carved rock, but at something else, something deeper. Images formed in the air itself, solid as memory, clear as truth. The pack gasped collectively. They were seeing the king's personal chambers as they had been 20 years ago. The furniture was different, the tapestries older, but the room was unmistakable. And there, standing over a bed where a gray-furred wolf lay sleeping, was a younger Leander Tide. The young Leander's face was twisted with something between grief and greed. In his hand, he held a dagger, not the ceremonial kind used in pack rituals, but a killing blade, slender and wickedly sharp, made of silver that gleamed even in the dim candlelight. "Father," the young Leander whispered in the vision, his voice thick with emotion, You're too soft, too merciful. Under your rule, we shelter the weak, we negotiate with enemies, we forgive. But forgiveness is weakness, and weakness invites conquest. The sleeping wolf, Alpha King Aldrich Tide, Leander's father, a leader beloved for his wisdom and compassion, stirred slightly but didn't rake. I'll make us strong again, young Leander continued. I'll make them fear us, and history will remember me as the king who saved the pack, not the son who... His voice broke. For a moment, the young Leander stood frozen, the dagger trembling in his hand. Then his face hardened, and he moved. The blade flashed. The sleeping king's eyes snapped open, wide with shock and betrayal. He tried to shift, to fight back, but the silver was already burning through his blood, paralyzing his wolf form, trapping him in the vulnerable space between human and beast. "I'm sorry," young Leander whispered, driving the dagger deeper. Alpha King Aldrich's mouth opened, perhaps to curse, perhaps to forgive, but no sound came. His eyes, so like his son's, yet infinitely gentler, dimmed, and then he was gone. The vision ended abruptly, and the great stone hall snapped back into focus. But the silence was different now. It was the silence of a world that had just watched its foundation crack apart. Elder Morna made a sound like a wounded animal. She had served under Aldrich for 40 years. She had been at his funeral, had mourned his tragic death by animal attack, and helped Leander ascend to the throne because the law demanded the Alpha's bloodline continue. "No," she breathed. "No, that's not... Leander, tell them it's a lie. Tell us." But Leander wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the 3 pups, and his face had transformed from shock into pure animal hatred. "You dare," he snarled, his voice dropping into a register that was more growl than speech. "Your pack?" The smallest pup stepped forward, and despite his size, despite his youth, every wolf in the hall felt the weight of his presence. "You murdered your way to a throne, Leander Tide. The pack was never yours. It was stolen." Leander shifted then, not fully, but enough that his human form twisted, his hands becoming claws, his teeth elongating into fangs. The shift was wrong, uncontrolled, the transformation of a wolf losing grip on both his humanity and his authority. "I did what was necessary," Leander roared, and in that moment he confirmed everything. His denial shattered against his own rage. "My father would have led us to ruin. He wanted to make peace with the Mountain Fang Pack, wanted to share territory, to dilute our bloodlines with treaties and intermarriage. He was weak." "He was merciful," Thalassé said quietly, but her voice carried, "and you couldn't tell the difference." Leander's claws gouged marks in the stone floor. His eyes, no longer cold and calculating, were wild with cornered animal desperation. "Mercy is weakness. Compassion is suicide. I have kept this pack strong for 20 years. We are feared. We are complicit," Elder Morna interrupted, her voice hollow. She looked around at the other elders, at the warriors, at the Omegas pressed against the walls. "We stood silent when he threw blind pups into the river. We obeyed when he exiled a healer for saving lives. We told ourselves it was strength, but it was cowardice dressed in law." Another elder stood, then another. Warriors who had followed Leander without a question now looked at him with dawning horror. The pack that had been unified by fear was fracturing, and Leander could see his power evaporating like morning mist. "You will obey me," Leander commanded, his voice breaking. "I am your Alpha King. The law says a king who sheds pack blood in darkness has no right to rule," the middle pup said, his silver eyes blazing. "That is the oldest law, Leander, the first law, and you broke it the night you killed your father." Leander lunged at the pup, murder in his eyes, but before he crossed half the distance, his legs buckled. He crashed to the stone floor like a falling timber, his partially shifted form convulsing. And that's when the pack realized the judgment had already begun.
Leander's scream filled the great stone hall, bouncing off ancient walls and drilling into every wolf's ears. But it wasn't a scream of rage anymore. It was pain, pure, primal, impossible pain. His body began to change, but not into wolf form. His coal-black fur, the pride of his bloodline, fell out in clumps, drifting to the stone floor like ash. His massive frame, built from years of dominance and fed by the pack's best kills, withered. Muscles that had torn through enemies like paper dissolved into sinew and bone. His skin, exposed now where the fur had been, turned gray and paper-thin, stretching over a skeleton that seemed to be collapsing inward. Within 30 seconds, the fearsome Alpha King, Leander Tide, had become a trembling, hairless wretch on the cold floor, looking less like a wolf and more like something that had been dead for weeks. The pack watched in frozen horror. This wasn't a wound that could be healed. This wasn't an attack that could be defended against. This was something else entirely. The three pups stepped forward in perfect unison, their silver eyes blazing brighter than ever. When they spoke, their voices layered into something that transcended the physical, multiple timbres, multiple ages, speaking as one entity. 20 years ago, the pups said, 3 kings died in darkness, not in battle, not in honorable challenge, in shadows and poison and carefully arranged accidents. The pack mourned them as tragedies, but the river remembers, time remembers, and we. The largest pup's form shimmered, and for just a moment, the wolves in the hall saw not a tiny pup, but the spectral form of a massive gray wolf with wise, ancient eyes. We are them, the voices continued. We are King Aldrich Tide, murdered by his son. We are Alpha Garrick Stone, poisoned before he could challenge the throne. We are Beta Theron Frost, whose hunting accident left no witnesses. The pack's collective gasp was audible. Reincarnation wasn't unheard of in werewolf theology. The Great Spirit was said to sometimes send souls back to finish unfinished business. But this was judgment made flesh. The law of the torrent, the small pup said, his voice now carrying the weight of King Aldrich himself, was never about testing the weak. It was a rite of passage, a sacred ceremony where pups who survived proved the Great Spirit's favor. But you, Leander, you corrupted it. You turned it into an execution tool, a way to eliminate anyone who might see your sins. The middle pup stepped closer to the collapsed king. You threw us into the river because you knew what we were. The moment we were born blind, the moment the pack whispered, "Sentinels," you knew we would see your hidden blood. So you tried to drown the truth before it could speak. Thalassa, who had remained silent through the revelation, finally moved. She walked to Leander's withered form and knelt beside him, her healer's instincts warring with her sense of justice. The river isn't just water, Leander. It's time, it's consequence, it's every choice flowing downstream until it reaches the sea. You tried to drown 3 kings, but the river brought them back, not as the powerful alphas they were, but as the weak, helpless creatures you claimed to despise. Leander's mouth opened, but no sound came. His amber eyes, dimmed and clouded now, fixed at Thalassa with something that might have been pleading. You wanted to teach the pack about strength. Let me teach you about justice. True strength isn't about who can kill the most or rule the longest. It's about who lifts up the fallen, who protects the helpless, who chooses mercy when cruelty would be easier. She stood and addressed the pack, her voice ringing clear.
For 20 years, we followed a king who told us compassion was weakness. We threw away our sick, drowned our imperfect, exiled our questioners. We called it strength, but it was fear. Fear that if we showed mercy, we would be seen as soft. Fear that if we helped the weak, we would become weak ourselves. Around the hall, warriors who had stood silent on the cliff 3 days ago while Thalassa jumped, warriors who had watched an Omega risk her life to save 3 pups and done nothing, began to shift uncomfortably. Then, one by one, they clutched their faces. The oldest warrior, a scarred male named Cade, who had personally helped throw 6 defective pups into the river over his lifetime, suddenly screamed. His hands went to his eyes, and when he pulled them away, his palms were wet with something that looked like tears but moved like smoke. "I can't," he gasped. "I can't see." Another warrior fell to his knees, then another. The blindness spread through the pack like wildfire, claiming every wolf who had stood on that cliff and watched without protest. Not the elders who had questioned, not the Omegas who had no power to stop it, but the warriors, the enforcers of Leander's cruel law, found their sight stripped away. "The Great Spirit gives us what we refuse to learn," the 3 pups said in unison. "You wanted a pack of the strong, warriors who could see threats and eliminate them without mercy, but you blinded yourselves to truth, to compassion, to the very bonds that make a pack worth protecting. So now you will learn to see as we see, not with eyes of flesh, but with hearts of understanding." Elder Morna, her face wet with tears, knelt before the pups. "What have we done? What have we become?" The small pup placed a tiny paw on her knee. "You have become a cautionary tale," he said, "but tales can have new chapters. The question is, will you write them differently?"
3 months passed before the Frost Claw pack resembled anything like a functional society again. The great stone hall, once the site of Leander's tyranny, had been transformed. The high throne where the Alpha King had presided over executions and exiles was gone, replaced by a circle of stones where all voices could be heard equally. Thalassa Vance sat in that circle now, but she didn't sit higher than the others. She had been named matriarch, not queen, but guide, by unanimous decision of the pack. It was the first time in the Frostclaw history that a healer had led, and the first time an Omega's voice carried the weight of law. She wore the silver wolf cloak from the hidden cavern, and her red hair, now streaked with premature white from the stress of transformation, was braided with tokens from every family in the pack. She was no longer invisible, but she had not sought visibility for its own sake. She had earned it through the hardest currency, truth. The 3 pups, no longer quite pups, grown now into adolescent wolves with powerful frames and eyes that still glowed silver, sat at the edges of the circle. They were called the Eyes of the North, and their role was unlike anything the pack had known. They didn't hunt, they didn't fight, they saw. When disputes arose, the eyes would look at the wolves involved and speak what they witnessed, the hidden resentments, the unspoken fears, the true motivations beneath the surface arguments. It was uncomfortable. It was exposing. It was exactly what the pack needed to heal from 20 years of enforced silence. The warriors who had lost their sight learned to navigate by sound, by scent, by the guidance of those they had once ignored. The Omegas, no longer the lowest rung of society, became the teachers. Children too young to have been complicit in the old ways became guides. The pack's structure inverted, and in that inversion, something unexpected happened. They became stronger. Not strong in the way Leander had defined it, not through fear and domination and the elimination of weakness. Strong in the way of roots intertwining, of walls built from many stones, of a pack that protected all its members because every member had value. Thalassa stood now at the edge of the Iron Falls, the same cliff where Leander had kicked 3 pups to what should have been their deaths.
The river churned below, unchanged and uncaring, its white foam still capable of killing anything that fell into its depths. Behind her, two warriors, both blind now, both learning humility, approached with careful steps. Between them, they guided a withered figure wrapped in rough cloth, Leander Tide. The former king had not died in his collapse. The Great Spirit, it seemed, had deemed a quick death too merciful. Instead, Leander lived, hairless, weak, dependent on others for every basic need. He couldn't feed himself, couldn't shift, couldn't command or threaten or inspire fear. He had become everything he had once despised, vulnerable, helpless, a burden. And the pack, under Thalassa's guidance, had chosen to care for him anyway. Why? Leander had asked once, his voice a rasp of its former power, when a young Omega brought him water and helped him drink. Because mercy isn't weakness, it's a choice, and we choose differently now. But today was different. Today, the pack had gathered for a reckoning. Thalassa turned as the warriors brought Leander to the cliff's edge. The entire pack stood in witness, blind warriors guided by seeing Omegas, elders with faces marked by guilt and determination, children who would grow up in a pack that valued compassion alongside strength. The three eyes of the north stepped forward. They had grown larger, more powerful, but their silver eyes remained unchanged, windows into truth that could not be lied to or manipulated. Leander Tide, the largest eye said, his voice carrying the authority of the three kings he contained. 20 years ago, you stood on this cliff and proclaimed the law of the torrent absolute. You said if the Great Spirit deemed the pups worthy, the current would carry them to the shallows. The smallest eye continued, you turned a sacred right into a tool of murder. You used it to eliminate threats, to enforce fear, to maintain a crown you stole in blood. The middle eye stepped closer to Leander. Today, we return you to the river, not as execution, as the trial you denied us. If the Great Spirit deems you worthy of redemption, the current will be gentle. If not, the eye's voice trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Leander's clouded eyes, so like the pups had been when he kicked them off this cliff, turned towards Thalassa. Would you do this? He whispered. After everything you've built, would you sink to my level? Thalassa met his gaze without flinching. I'm not sinking to your level, Leander. I'm giving you exactly what you gave those pups. A chance, more than you deserved, more than you gave your father. But the river will judge you now, not me. Two warriors lifted the woven basket, the same basket that had carried 3 blind pups 3 months ago, and placed it at the cliff's edge. Leander was placed inside, his withered body barely filling half the space the pups had occupied. The law of the torrent, Thalassa said, her voice carrying over the assembled pack, is no longer a law in this pack. But for you, Leander, we make an exception. You believed so deeply in the river's judgment. Let's see if your faith was justified. She nodded to the warriors. They didn't kick the basket. They placed it gently at the very edge and stepped back. For a long moment, Leander sat in the basket, staring at the churning water below. The same water that had nearly killed Thalassa. The same water that had birthed the truth he tried to drown. I was trying to save them, Leander said suddenly, his voice cracking of its former power. My father's weakness would have destroyed us. The other packs would have... You were trying to save yourself, the smallest eye interrupted, from accountability, from change, from the possibility that strength and mercy could coexist. Leander had no response. What defense could stand against truth spoken by the very kings he murdered? The wind picked up, and the basket rocked. Leander closed his eyes. And then, without ceremony or countdown, the river's spray intensified. A gust of wind, or perhaps something more deliberate, caught the basket and pulled it over the edge. The pack watched in silence as Weander Tide fell into the Iron Falls, exactly as he sentenced 3 innocent pups to fall. But this time, there was no Thalassa to jump after him. The basket hit the water and was immediately swallowed by the white foam. The pack waited, watching the shallows downstream where survivors were supposed to emerge. Minutes passed, then an hour. No one came crawling from the river. "The water has spoken," Elder Morna said quietly, "and its judgment is final." Thalassa turned away from the cliff, and the pack followed her back towards the great stone hall. Behind them, the Iron Falls continued its eternal roar, indifferent to the justice it had dispensed, caring only for the ancient rhythm of water over stone. As they walked, the smallest eye moved close to Thalassa's side.
"Do you regret it?" he asked softly, his child's voice momentarily breaking through the kingly authority. Thalassa considered the question. "I regret that it was necessary," she finally said. "I regret that mercy had to look like judgment, but I don't regret giving him the same chance he gave you. The Great Spirit decides who drowns and who survives. We just made the introduction." The eye nodded, satisfied. That night, around fires that burned warmer than they had in years, the pack told stories. Not stories of conquest or domination, but stories of the healer who jumped, the pups who returned, the pack that learned to see with more than eyes. And in the years that followed, the Frost Claw pack became known not for their strength in battle, but for their strength in wisdom. Not for the enemies they defeated, but for the outcasts they welcomed. Not for the weak they eliminated, but for the vulnerable they protected. The law of the torrent was abolished. The Iron Falls became a place of remembrance, not execution. A reminder that what you throw into the river of life will eventually wash back to your shore, either as a blessing or a curse. Thalassa ruled for 30 years, and when she finally passed into the Great Spirit's embrace, the pack mourned her as they had never mourned Leander. They mourned her as you mourn someone who taught you not just how to survive, but how to be worthy of survival. The 3 eyes of the North lived far longer than normal wolves, their reincarnated souls bound to a purpose that transcended a single lifetime. They remained as the conscience of the pack, the living reminder that sight is not the same as seen, and strength without mercy is just cruelty wearing a crown. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind howled through the mountains, travelers swore they could hear 3 voices speaking in unison from the depths of the Iron Falls, not in threat, but in promise. The weight of a leader is measured by how they treat those who can do nothing for them, for what you throw into the river of life will eventually wash back to your shore, either as a blessing or a curse. Friends, thank you for walking this journey with me. If this story reminded you that true strength is found in compassion, that mercy is not weakness, but courage, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, the world is watching how we treat those who cannot defend themselves. The river always remembers. Until next time, may you choose mercy when the world demands cruelty, and may you have the courage to jump when others only watch.